Now from Fox. I'm your host, Corella Hara. We will continue to showcase some more of these Veterans Day events in just a moment. But first, I want to touch on some big breaking news that we brought you just within the last hour. I'm taking a look here at a tweet from our partners at Fox at 59 News. It says this: Richard Allen guilty of murdering Abby Williams and Libby German. So a jury in the small town in Indiana of Delphi found Richard Allen guilty of murder in the 2017 killings of two teenage girls who vanished along a popular hiking trail. Deliberations stretched all the way into the fourth day, but ultimately, jurors found the state's evidence, including a bullet match and several confessions, compelling enough to convict him. Now, there's plenty to get into in this case, so to help us do that, we're going to be joined by legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani. Neama, good to see you, and thanks for being with us today. Let's just start with you giving us your thoughts. What was the most eye-catching part of this entire trial?
Well, aside from the graphic photos of Libby and Abby having their throats slashed, I think the most powerful testimony for the state was Richard Allen's words himself. He confessed over 60 times while in custody. Of course, the defense argued that he was suffering from mental health issues and that those confessions weren't necessarily knowing and voluntary. But when he's talking to his mother and his wife, and he's talking about facts of the murder that only he would know, particularly the white van that passed by when the murders happened. I think that was the strongest evidence for the state, in addition to the unspent round that Corell you were talking about.
Neama, you mentioned it a little bit within this last answer you provided for us, but these confessions of Allen really compelling for those jurors to convict him. However, there were arguments made that these confessions were done by Allen after he had been in solitary confinement for quite some time, kind of warping his direction of how these events went. But how does that come into play when we're seeing a trial like this?
Well, Allen had to be separated from the general population because of the nature of the charges and really for his own safety. But clearly, it took a toll on him. He lost significant weight. He was a very different person in court than the mugshot when he was arrested. He was acting very erratically. At one point, he took off his clothes. He was washing his face in the toilet, eating paper, even smearing feces over his face. So obviously, the prosecution argued that that doesn't mean that the confessions weren't true and that some of this was a front or a show. But ultimately, I think the fact that Allen admitted to being at the scene of the murders, there were witnesses that identified him being there. Obviously, that Snapchat video that we've all seen where he says to go down the hill, his admitting to that. And again, I think that unspent round that really matches the state's theory of the case. Allen said that he was planning to rape the young girls and then got spooked when that white van showed up. I think he does have a chance on appeal because the judge didn't allow him to make the Odinism argument. And I know there are a lot of folks that think that maybe the judge should have let that in, even though there wasn't a whole lot of evidence about that. So I think he does have a fighting chance on appeal, but I think short of that, he's going to die in Indiana State Prison because he's looking at very significant time, up to 130 years.
Let's talk more about these ballistics and the bullet match. A police testifying that a bullet, quote, had been cycled through Allen's handgun. But another firearms expert called by the defense questioned the state police bullet analysis. So, Neama, can you speak more to the challenges that come with ballistic testing and how often that is used in criminal cases like this?
Quite often, and there was really two sets of evidence that I think really required expert testimony. The first is that bullet testimony, that unspent round, and the prosecution's expert said that it matched a firearm in Allen's home that they recovered when they executed that search warrant. Now, it was unspent, which means it wasn't fired. So the question was the expert testimony reliable? The expert did rely on some photos, and the defense said, well, it should have been actual physical examination of the firearm. So ultimately, the jury did side with the prosecution. There was also a key piece of evidence, and that was Libby's cell phone. Now, it did go out of service for some period of time, and there was some testimony by the defense that someone actually plugged in an earphone into the jack. So that really undermine the state's theory of the case that the girls were murdered during the afternoon and they were found by folks who were searching the next day. Of course, the defense's argument was that this was all staged. The girls were killed someplace else and their bodies actually moved to the area close to the bridge because of this pagan sacrifice, this ritual. Again, some of that evidence didn't come in, but to the extent that the girls weren't killed where their bodies were found, that would have been a good theory for the defense, but ultimately the jury rejected that argument.
So the timeline from the murders to the arrest and the conviction is also a bit hazy, including some of that evidence that was presented. Can you speak about how the lengthy investigation could lead to some questions in people's minds as to whether there's really justice done with this arrest?
There's a lot of folks who are watching that think that maybe Allen is innocent or, the prosecution or law enforcement botched this case. I mean, let's not forget Allen admitted to seeing the girls shortly before they died and being there. And there was really no follow up on that lead because really it was placed in it was sort of the wrong file, more or less. And I think people were really critical before Allen was arrested. There was speculation that the girls were being catfished by someone, and that this individual would be arrested. So Allen was working at CVS in this small town. He never took off after the murders. So leading some people to believe that maybe he was set up or he was framed by folks in the Indiana State prison sentence. Obviously, I'm a former prosecutor and I believe in our jury system. So I don't necessarily believe those arguments, but there's a lot out there on social media saying that this was a really strange investigation. It took so long to find Allen when he was really right under their noses.
You know, Nima, outside of the courthouse, we saw so many people. I mean, people that were for this conviction, those that were against this conviction. Just to kind of wrap this conversation up, talk to us about what happens once again going forward, and if you think that this verdict we have today would really lead to closure for all of these people that have been affected.
I think it does lead to closure, but if I'm the state, I'm somewhat concerned about that appeal. We know the defense wanted to argue that this was all a setup, that there were folks in the Indiana State prison system that were members of this, pagan white nationalist cult, this Odinism cult, and they're the ones that coerced the confession from Richard Allen. There was some question of Dr. Walla, the prison psychologist, and whether she had provided Allen information that was used in the confession. But ultimately, I think the defense has a fighting chance in appeal in this case because their argument, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree with it, was that this was all staged. And, they had some evidence of the placement of the girls, where their extremities were, where there were some sticks that were put on them as well. Their clothes were mismatched. That was all part of this ritual sacrifice. And the judge really didn't allow any of it. So there's an argument, at least that the defense has, that this violated his Sixth Amendment rights. So it's been interesting to see what the Indiana appellate courts do with this conviction. I think more than other murder convictions, there's a decent chance that this comes back after it's appealed.
Legal analyst Neama Rahmani, always a pleasure to have you here at Live Now from Fox to break down this really lengthy and complicated case there. And we'll see what happens going forward. And we'll bring you back on again, of course, to discuss.
Thanks, bro. Talk to you soon.
Of course. See you later.